everyone. If you've been living under a rock, maybe you haven't heard, but Broadcom and the VMware, well, I guess I would say fiasco, is causing some major headaches for a lot of organizations. People are seeing vast, multiple 300, 400% increases in licensing costs. So a lot of organizations are looking to move away from VMware and go elsewhere. So in this episode of the Security Swarm podcast, I've got Paul Schnackenberg on. We're going to be talking about moving away from VMware into various places in the Microsoft ecosystem, how to do it, and we're going to talk about the security implications of doing so. So that and lots more on today's episode of the Security Swarm podcast. Hey everyone, welcome back for another episode of the Security Swarm podcast, the podcast that brings you the knowledge and insights straight from the security lab here at Hornet Security. As always, I'm your host, Andy Sirwich, and I've got, I'm just going to say co-host at this point. You've been on so many episodes, Paul. I'm going to make you an honorary co-host at this point. How's it going, Paul?
Thank you very much. Yeah, I'm pretty good. Yeah, I noticed we have skipped my introduction in the last few, so if somebody didn't know who I was, they're just getting in cold. But then again, we don't introduce you either, so we sort of assume that people know who we are at this point. So
that's true. And I mean, you've been on so many episodes. I have to go back and look. I'm gonna have to do a percentage analysis of how many episodes are yours versus everybody else's, and I bet you it's close to 50%.
Maybe you do some really good sessions though. I've been listening to quite a few of the other ones, and Eric Siren and John Bakker, the ones you did recently on Passkeys.
Oh yeah,
they were excellent. So yeah, no, I enjoyed those.
That Passkeys stuff we've been talking a lot about that, Jan and I. It's fun stuff, exciting stuff, and has got me. It's the first thing that's gotten me excited about identity in a while, but that's probably a whole different conversation.
It is.
I'm getting away from our topic today, and our topic today is an interesting one because we are shifting gears a little bit. We are, of course, a security podcast, right? And all of you tune in to listen about security talk. So what would you say if I told you we were going to talk about migrating away from VMware today? Right?
Yeah.
And you're going to ask, Andy, what does that have to do with security? Well, there's some security implications there, which we're going to get into later on in today's discussion. But Paul, I know what we're talking about to start with is, well, one, there's kind of a dumpster fire over at Broadcom with VMware right now. So there's that. And then we're going to get into the different ways that you can migrate off, right? And I guess let's start with the dumpster fire, as we tend to do on this show, right? We usually tend to start with the dumpster fire. And, well, I mean, unless you've been living under a rock, you've heard the news that Broadcom purchased VMware. Boy, this was some time ago. Was it last year? I've kind of lost track. Feels
like it was even longer ago than that. It feels
maybe
3 years ago. I mean, they didn't seem to touch it much in the beginning. I think it was a little bit further back in time. And of course, VMware overall has bounced around. Like they were their own company, then they were part of Dell for a while, and then they got sold off. So, that's never a good sign, I think, for a company.
Right. And I mean, VMware and I go way back. I was certified in vSphere. Heck, this was before it was even called vSphere. VMware 3.5. I was certified in vSphere 4, which was the first, the point where they started calling it vSphere. And I used version 5 and 6. Stopped using it around 7. So I have a history with VMware. And those that know me know that my Microsoft MVP award was originally in Hyper-V before they generalized the competency areas, and I became a cloud and data center management MVP. So people are always surprised to hear, like, Andy, you're the Hyper-V guy. Like, you used VMware? I sure did. And I used both. And I don't want this whole episode to come off like, we're just stomping on VMware. VMware, it's a good product. It's a good tool set. I mean, ESXi was ahead of the game in many ways, and I would argue that ESXi brought virtualization to the masses. you know?
I'm a
And
Hyper-V guy through and through, and I absolutely agree with you. I mean, the kudos was kudos is due. VMware really brought
yep,
server virtualization to the mainstream, and Microsoft was absolutely playing catch up. If you're looking, say, around
yep,
2008, 2010, something like that, they were absolutely playing catch up with Hyper-V.
for sure.
So, and there's a lot of other cool things. Like I think VMware was first with vMotion, moving
Yep.
VMs between hosts without downtime. They did a lot of very cool stuff, and they did a very strong technology base back then for data center virtualization.
Yep. Yep.
Unfortunately,
And so
somebody moved the goalposts on them. Anyway, go on.
just just a bit, right? And of course you're talking about public cloud, right? And
Absolutely,
so
and that's what happened. And I suppose so. So we're not absolutely not banging on. I mean, VMware themselves basically are not to blame for what's happening. I think it's I don't know, pure greed from Broadcom's sides. I mean, it seems like they're trying to squeeze out the
right.
last few millions out of this acquisition, and they don't seem to be putting a lot of effort into maintaining the technology or innovating in VMware's products.
Yeah, it's true, unfortunately. And I think it's funny you mentioned they moved the goalposts. There was a time, and maybe it was on this show. I remember Eric and we were having a conversation about VMware. Eric Siren, another co-host of the show, we were having a conversation about VMware and Hyper-V one time, and I remember making the comment. This was a couple years back, where this is when VMware was with Dell at the time. I remember thinking and saying at one point that, I feel like VMware's strategy lately is like, let's just create a bunch of new things and we'll throw them all against the wall and see which one sticks, right? And it really feels like, I think that was their response to the public cloud, right? Like you said, the goalposts have moved because of public cloud. And so
Yeah.
then they got bounced around. Now they're at Broadcom. Like you said, they're trying to squeeze as much money out of them as they can. And I, there's been so much drama around the Broadcom VMware thing that to be honest, I haven't paid super close attention to that. But from what I've heard, they have basically made this. I don't know if you'd call it a strategic decision. I guess from their perspective, it's a strategic decision that we're going to hold on to the top X percentage of largest customers, and they're just okay with losing organizations that fall outside of that, from what I've heard. Maybe that's just the public's perception, right? And so what this is translating into is very large increases in people's licensing costs, like by orders of magnitude. Just go into any Reddit thread on the VMware subreddit, and you will find all kinds of insane increases in people's licensing costs. I mean, like more than 100% increase, more than 200% increase. I'd like
Yeah,
those are on the low end,
yeah, exactly. Yeah, a colleague of ours, whom we're not going to name, was saying that they paid 2 million last year, and their quote for a license renewal for the coming year was 10 million. So that's a 5x. That's a 5x increase, and I mean that's really stiff, and it's sort of telling you that the company behind it don't really care about you as a customer. And I mean, that's a
Right.
lot of money. Like, to me, that's not a small company saying, "Hey, we've got 2 years XI licenses. Can we renew them
Right.
for next year, please?" I mean, that's a big installation to me. And I suppose, secondly, that also tells me as a customer that, hey, you guys are probably not going to put an enormous amount of effort into making this product super relevant. And here's the security angle that we wanted to take here, because there's been some fairly high profile issues in VMware's products over the last couple of years that have come to light. And you have a particular one that you wanted to look at.
I do. It's fairly recent. Back on the 6th of March, Ars Technica reported on this, and I'll link this in the show notes. And I will also link the specific CVEs that are listed in this article as well. But there were 4 CVEs that came out recently. We've got CVE 2024, 22252, 53, 54, and 55. And there's a variation of different issues here. We've got a use after free vulnerability in the XHCI USB controller. Another use after free vulnerability in the UHCI USB controller. We have out of bounds write vulnerabilities. And then another USB controller vulnerability here. And they have variations of different CVSS scores. I see 8.4, a 9.3 for the workstation / fusion side of it. So a variation of different issues. And basically what this amounts to is a sandbox escape bug, which, when you're talking virtualization, that's like a cardinal sin, right? Is allowing anything to escape the bounds of the virtual machine.
Yeah.
So to your point, Paul, they are not without their security flaws. And to your point, there's clear evidence that maybe they're not going to focus on maintaining and fixing and improving like, the VMware of old, right?
Yeah.
I don't know that for sure. That's an opinion.
Exactly. These are opinions. We're looking from the outside. We don't have inside information. I mean, it might also be, it's not a far off guess, I would say, that if you were a VMware engineer that has been with this company for a long time, built up these products, if you're seeing what management is doing to your baby, your product at this point, you may not hang around. Like, that's another thing. I mean, we've heard of layoffs, so it might simply be that, the engineers that are there are doing their best, but they're not as many of them as there was, 12 months ago. So they might have a tough situation there as well. It may not, I don't know that the management at Broadcom is going, hey, let's just fire everybody who's maintaining security patches for VMware, because that's not going to fly either. But it's probably a confluence of different reasons. So,
right, exactly. And I mean, when I look at some of the vulnerabilities like this and just think about where they're at, if I am a sysadmin or a team of sysadmins and I'm responsible for the infrastructure in my organization, now I have to do a risk assessment, right? Like, okay, is this one, am I okay with the more than likely huge increase in the licensing?
Yeah.
Two, now I have to do that risk analysis. And so a lot of people are finding themselves in a case where we need to move somewhere, right?
Yeah, that's right.
And there's been a lot of conversation lately about like, move to Proxmox or Nutanix or and the one that surprises me is I don't see it mentioned that, hey, let's migrate to Azure or Hyper-V. And newsflash, and I can say this as a Hyper-V person, you'll see a lot of posts out on the internet, and I don't know why they're still around, but there's this perception that Hyper-V has been deprecated or has been ignored. Hyper-V is not deprecated. It is part of Azure. It is part of Windows Server. It runs Xbox. That one comes as a surprise to a lot of people, as Hyper-V is actually running on Xbox.
Yeah.
They have not abandoned it. It is not abandonware. It is not deprecated. Hyper-V is alive and kicking. It is an amazing hypervisor today. So I can get off my Hyper-V soapbox now.
No. I'm on the same soapbox standing right next to you. That's so funny when people say that. I'm like, no. I think there's two parts to that. First of all, let's bag Microsoft. That's a popular pastime. Everybody likes to do that. And we do too here, but from a security point of view, not a Hyper-V point of view.
Right.
But I think the second thing is that Microsoft always saw virtualization as a part of the underlying operating system, like a feature. For VMware, it was the focus. Like, it was the thing that you needed to focus on was the virtualization itself. For Microsoft, it was always a means to an end. So Hyper-V is around, and it's definitely being continuously developed, and they have lots of developers on it because all of Azure runs on Hyper-V. As you said, Xbox, Hyper-V is everywhere. Like, it's in Windows Server, it's in Windows Client, it's everywhere. So, like, it ain't going anywhere. And as long as Microsoft has Azure, and as long as they run Azure on Hyper-V, which they will indefinitely, or as long as public cloud is around, they're going to continue developing it. So that's not like, and when you talk about scale, like people say, oh, VMware can do bigger things. That's not true anymore. Hyper-V, because in Azure, people come along, like big enterprises saying, oh, we got SAP instances with, VMs that have, 14 terabytes of memory. Can you do that? And Azure is like, yeah, that's a small machine, mate. We've got those. No worries. You can run a virtual machine much bigger than that in Azure. And the same comes down to Hyper-V. So if you really, really, really need to run a gigantic physical machine with gigantic virtual machines, absolutely Hyper-V can do it for you, and efficiently and all that. So no, Hyper-V ain't going anywhere.
Right. I always used to keep track of the the config maximums, as they've been called, and because it was always Clash of the Titans, right? Okay, is VMware or Hyper-V better? You know what? I stopped paying attention probably 6 or 7 years ago, because they reached a size on both sides of that discussion that was so by and far higher than what I would ever need as a sysadmin, that it just didn't matter anymore, right?
Absolutely, and exactly like you, same thing. I follow that pissing match between the two of them for years, but I mean, now it's beyond ridiculous. Like, I'm never going to work with a virtual machine with 24 terabytes of memory, 24,000 gigabytes of memory, but somewhere in the world there's somebody who's willing to pay for one of those things, and
that's very true.
And there it is. Hyper-V support.
Very true. So we've kind of talked about, we've kind of set the scene, I guess, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, well, you've made the choice to move. How do you get from point A to point B? What are your options for going from VMware to somewhere in the Microsoft ecosystem? Because like I said, I see a lot of conversations happening about Proxmox and Nutanix. Not a lot of conversations happening. Surprisingly, it still surprises me that Microsoft is not shouting from the rooftops on this. But how do you get from VMware to the Microsoft ecosystem? And I guess the first place we should start, Paul, is just going straight to Azure without just avoiding the whole on-premises thing altogether, right? Which may not be a fit for all organizations. There's some organizations that, due to compliance reasons, maybe have a requirement to keep some data on-prem, or maybe they just bought hardware last year and they want to, realize the full scope of that investment. There's a lot of reasons why you may not want to go completely 100% cloud, but some organizations can, right?
Yep.
And so we've got Azure Migrate, right, Paul?
Yes, that's right. So basically, going to Azure, you really have two options. So we're going to talk about the first one first, which is straight to Azure Virtual Machines, native Azure Virtual Machines. Then we're going to talk about Azure VMware Solution. But so Microsoft in Azure has a free tool called Azure Migrate. It also integrates with third-party tools if you need specialized, scenarios where you want that third party to help you out. But Azure Migrate by itself is agentless in most scenarios for VMware, scales up to 10,000 virtual machines in your on-premises infrastructure per appliance. So you download this one appliance, you got the right permissions, stick it on your vCenter environment. It will discover all your VMs, it will discover their sizes, it will discover what applications they're running, what operating systems, of course Windows and Linux both supported. It'll discover how they're related to each other. So this database on this server serves these through 3 web front ends or whatever, however that's mapped up with dependency mapping. It'll discover all of that. And it will also look, if you want to, it can look at the actual performance. So often we find in on-premises environments that the VMs are actually scaled bigger than they need to be, because on-prem you don't sort of pay for that, right? Like you pay for the hardware anyway. So if you give the machine 8 gigs of RAM or 24 gigs of RAM, it doesn't really matter that much as long as you've got enough in your hosts, right? But when you're in the cloud, you actually pay for the size of the machine you're having. So it can look at the actual performance requirements of the workload over, say, a week or something, or a couple of weeks. And then based on that, it can say, well, you've got a 6 vCPU, 12 gigs of RAM machine here, but actually you can get away with a 4 vCPU and 8 gigs of RAM machine in Azure.
Right.
So once you have all that discovery, you can then it does all the assessments, and then you can basically start migrating. So you define groups or waves of VMs that you want to migrate to Azure. It'll copy the configuration up to a sort of a ghost virtual machine in the cloud, and then it'll start copying the data from the disks. And obviously, depending on how many disks you've got, how much data you've got, what's the size of the pipe to the cloud, this will take X amount of time. It will eventually get to the point where the disks are synchronized, and then any disk writes on-prem are written up in the cloud on a sort of continuous basis. Then you can do a test failover, so you can go in and say, oh, let's test these 5 machines, see how they work together, make sure they work properly in the cloud. So they're in an isolated virtual network in Azure. You boot them up, you test out your applications, maybe bring in some application owners to verify that everything is working the way it should. When you are certain that it's all good and fix any issues, of course, that might crop up, you can then do the actual production failover, which will shut down the VMs on-prem, synchronize up the last lot of data, and then boot up the machines in the cloud. Job done.
Yeah, pretty cut and dry there. And like you said, also allows you to migrate to things like Azure SQL DB and web apps, which is
That's right.
really nice because there's so many times where I've run into like these little tiny web apps. I don't know what it is about manufacturing organizations. Manufacturing organizations love these little tiny web apps for some reason, at least in my experience. And it's like, oh man, this would be perfect for, Azure web apps, and so it'd be nice. I've not used Azure Migrate in this way, but I've seen that it can be used in that way. And I always think to myself, I'm like, it'd be so nice to be able to do that if I was a sysadmin in the trenches again, right? So that's a nice add to that particular tool set.
It is, absolutely. And that's a good point you raised there. I should have covered that as well. So we often talk about a lift and shift, right? So you've got, 200 or 2,000 virtual machines on-prem. Like if you're under extreme time pressure to get off VMware really, really quickly because your license renewal is coming up or whatever, sure, you just pick them all up, shove them in the cloud, make sure you've got a good connection up to the cloud, and then run them all in Azure. Job done. But you haven't really modernized your infrastructure in any way. Like you're still running VMs. You still got to patch them every month. You still got to monitor them. You got to manage them. You got to secure them. You got to back them up. Like it's still VMs, right? Which is a lot of management overhead. Now there is auto manage in Azure that will help you as well, but you're still dealing with VMs, right? They're big, unwieldy, and not sort of cloudy. So one of the things, as you mentioned, that you can do along the way here is if you see, if Azure Migrate sees a SQL server, it can say, hey, actually, you don't need to copy these 3 big virtual machines that is running SQL Server. You can actually convert these databases into an Azure SQL database, which is a PaaS service, where you don't have to worry about the underlying infrastructure. You just pick the size of the machines you need. Right. And the same thing with web apps. And I should also mention here, as far as costs go, you want to look at reserved instances, because if you know that you're going to run these VMs for at least the next year or something, you can sort of reserve instances and have those paid for. And there's also another way you can do that in Azure. I've forgotten now the name of it, but there are ways of saving money because you're sort of committing upfront to having a set of machines running.
Right, exactly. And speaking in generalities, this doesn't apply to every service, but speaking in generalities, it is more cost effective to run PaaS services than it is IaaS, a full VM. And the other thing you got to look at, when you lift and shift like that, maybe there's some VMs that don't need to be running 24/7. So now you can look at things like, auto VM shutdown, and then using things like runbooks in order to boot VMs up when they're needed, making sure that you're cost optimizing. There's a whole series of episodes that we could do, even though it's not security related, so we probably won't cover it on this show. But there's a whole series of episodes somebody could do on cost optimization in Azure, right?
And somebody has done. So
I'm sure.
There's plenty of them out there. All right. So second option, if you really are wedded to VMware and you really want the VMware experience, Microsoft has for many years offered the Azure VMware Solution, AVS. not to be confused with AWS. So here you essentially get a managed cluster or a set of clusters in Azure on bare metal. So there's no Hyper-V inside. You literally have physical machines that are running VMware's latest stack, and Microsoft keeps all this up to date. And you can then incorporate those ESXi hosts or vSphere hosts into your vCenter on-prem. So they will show up as part of your infrastructure. And you can literally start moving VMs off your on-premises VMware environment up into the cloud VMware environment. Now, you get a bunch of benefits here. You can integrate with a bunch of other Azure services, right? So again, you want to transform a SQL Server VM into an Azure PaaS SQL database. That works as well, and you can do that once it's up there. You can, of course, use Azure Backup to back up these machines on a regular basis and all that sort of thing. The one thing, and it is a PaaS service, so you're not managing the hardware and you're not managing the software on these machines. But what you do want to look at here is that this is an enterprise service. So whilst it doesn't come with the price hike that you get from Broadcom, because here you're paying per hour that you're running this thing, you do want to really look at your cost management here and do some calculations up front. Of course, again, here you're looking at reserved instances because you know you're going to be running this cluster or these clusters, 24/7. So well worth looking. Oh, and you get extended security updates with both of these. So if you have older versions like 08R2, 12R2, who are now out of extended support, so they don't get patches, if you're running them on Azure, either on AVS or as native Azure virtual machines, you get extended security updates for free without having to pay the exponentially increasing cost each year to get the patches for the older operating systems.
Right. And it feels like that's one of the methods they use to incentivize this type of move, right? So those extended security updates, because the bean counters like that incentive sometimes, depending on the organization, right? So, all right, well, very cool. The other thing I just thought of, kind of jumping back to the previous discussion really quick, in terms of migrating workloads, there might even be some workloads that you could migrate to Microsoft 365 as well, right? So like I've seen many organizations that have basically replaced file services with SharePoint, right? Now it's not a perfect match for every organization, but that's something that you might want to look at as well too, right? So
absolutely. And Azure Files. So if you have file servers on-prem today that you're running on your VMware infrastructure, instead of picking up the VMs and now having VMs that you're again going to manage and maintain and all that in the cloud, you can use Azure Files to hook up your file shares on-prem to Azure Files platform as a service file shares in the cloud. And that's a beautiful technology. That works seamlessly. It's an excellent opportunity to move all your file shares up into the cloud and literally then just turn off the file service on-prem. So that's absolutely well worth looking at.
So I've presented on Azure Files at a couple of different conferences, and the way I always explain it, just to get a few laughs from the seasoned sysadmins in the audience, it's like DFS, but it's actually good, right? But I usually preface that with
works.
Right, exactly. And I usually preface that with like, hey, before I get into this, who remembers DFS? And who actually liked DFS? And there's no hands up in the crowd, right? It's just anyway, Azure Files, yes. Amazing.
Yes. Yeah, it's a great solution, really.
So we've talked about the cloud native routes here, right? Now we're in the area where, like, hey, you're going to pry these servers out of my cold, dead hands. And I'm, of course, quoting an article that you wrote, Paul, by the way. And I don't think we've mentioned that yet. Paul has written an excellent article on this subject, and we'll link that in the show notes as well. Assuming it's published by the time this episode is put out, which we think it will be. But take a look there. It should be there. Anyway, so now we're assuming that we're going to stay on-prem we've got a number of different options, right? We've got, Windows Server with Hyper-V. We basically do all the same things with the Hyper-V side of the equation that we do with the VMware side, right? You've got Azure Stack HCI, and I have to criticize Microsoft here a little bit because Azure Stack HCI, the name drives me crazy. We probably talked about this on the show before. Everybody, when they see Azure Stack HCI, unless you know what it is, people just assume it's some Azure thing, right?
Yep.
Really what it is it's a modified version of Windows Server with Hyper-V, software-defined networking, and storage spaces direct, all packaged up and has the Azure Stack HCI label on it. Now, that's not to say there's no Azure services that go along with it. You can actually use Azure Arc to pull the management of those Azure Stack HCI instances into the Azure control plane, and then you can do a lot of really cool stuff from there. One thing I noticed today, I'm not sure how long it's been around. I noticed this morning that I had an Arc enabled machine that I was tinkering with. It looks like you can actually launch Windows Admin Center from within the Azure interface now. It's in preview.
Yep.
It's probably been there forever, and I just now noticed it, right?
Not forever, but it is a fairly recent thing, and it is very, very cool.
Right.
In the latest versions of Azure Stack HCI, you can literally manage the whole thing from the cloud if you want to.
Right.
You can literally spin up Windows Admin Center in the cloud and run the whole thing from Azure. Other things to mention about Azure Stack HCI is that you can, there's three flavors of this. You can buy it as, you buy the individual machines, and as long as they're on the Azure Stack HCI catalog, you get validated nodes. You can also buy a pre-installed integrated system. So you go to Dell or HP or Lenovo or whoever, there's, 25 people or 25 organizations on the list, and you just buy a pre-made system from them. It comes with Azure Stack HCI set up. It comes with the storage configured. Comes exactly the way you want it configured, and it just shows up in the data center, and you just plug it in, and you're good to go. There is also the third one, is the Premier solutions. So this is a smaller subset of the catalog that literally is sort of white glove, often hardware as a service. So instead of paying, X amount of 100,000 upfront for the actual hardware, or tens of thousands if it's a smaller cluster, you pay per month, right? You're literally renting the hardware, and you get the white glove experience. Again, it'll be completely pre-installed, pre-configured, set up, and ready to go. And of course, the HCI part is hyperconverged infrastructure. So for a VMware person, you are thinking vSAN and NSX, I think they call it, with the software-defined networking. So you've got your flash storage. I mean, you can have hard drives if you want to, but today you probably have flash storage in all your hosts, and that's all shared between all the hosts in a highly redundant fashion. So if one host goes down, the VMs will automatically reboot on other hosts, and the storage, you have multiple copies on multiple servers, and transparently in the background, you just keep on working. The other thing to mention here is this is very modern, so you can do things like run Kubernetes on this, and you can run AKS, so Azure Kubernetes Services, the managed platform that is updated from the cloud on your own physical hardware in your own data center. Microsoft will upgrade AKS for you so that it's all managed, and you just run your containers on top of Kubernetes.
Yeah, it's a neat solution. I really enjoy Azure Stack HCI when I use it. I don't have it running in my lab right now, but for a while there, I had a 2-node Azure Stack HCI cluster running in the basement underneath me, underneath my desk. So I will say, the other thing that comes up as part of the conversation of the moving to the Microsoft side is, like, you got people coming from VMware, they're used to working with vCenter, right? Well, there must be some vCenter type thing for, the Microsoft ecosystem. And a lot of people see System Center Virtual Machine Manager and make the assumption that that's the vCenter equivalent. Don't assume that. Don't assume that. You do not need System Center Virtual Machine Manager to do things like clustering and live migration and things like that. So that's an evaluation you'll have to make for your specific instance. some of the things that you get with System Center Virtual Machine Manager, it's intended more for those really large enterprises, but it can do things like like the things that you would do with resource pools, for example, in VMware, where you've got, I don't know, the finance department, they have their own virtualization admin, and you want to carve off resources for that person to build their own VMs, things like that. There's some nice, network or some nice advanced software-defined networking options inside of System Center Virtual Machine Manager. But you get some of those with SDN and Azure Stack HCI as well. So you have to kind of make that determination of which one's going to work best for your particular needs. So anyway.
Yeah, no, that's a fair point. I mean, Windows Admin Center, which is free, it really covers most of the scenarios you want to do with clustering, whether you're talking to Azure Stack HCI or Windows Server. Last thing I'll mention on Azure Stack HCI, that it comes out, there's two new versions of it every year. And it is sort of a bit of a canary for what's going to come in Windows Server. So new features come out in Azure Stack HCI, then they show up in the next version of Windows Server. So, for example, we have GPU virtualization and GPU pooling in Azure Stack HCI, and that's coming in Windows Server 2025. So you can do things like have a set of desktop virtual machines, for example, serving engineers. And you can have 1 or 2 or 3 big GPUs in your hosts, and then you carve up so that each virtual machine that is a desktop for an engineer gets a slice of a GPU to work with. Or if you're doing machine learning inferencing, you can have a slice of a GPU to work with. The other thing you can do is you can live migrate machines that are running on GPUs. So you can pick up a virtual machine from one host, and move it to another host. And as long as there's GPU capacity in both ends, it's the same as we do with live migration normally with the memory of a host, but now it's the graphics memory and it's moved from one to the other, which is very, very cool. So before I forget, coming on System Center Virtual Machine Manager, the other thing you can do with Virtual Machine Manager is you can manage VMware. So you can use System Center Virtual Machine Manager to manage your VMware infrastructure, which might come in handy if you're looking to do the migration from one to the other. And you're actually going, hey, and you can also manage Azure Stack HCI with System Center Virtual Machine Manager. But if you're looking to sort of go, hey, we're going to bite the bullet, we're going to move off VMware, but we have to stay on-prem, right? We just have to run everything on-prem for whatever regulation or reason you might have. Well, then Windows Server, Hyper-V, and System Center Virtual Machine Manager, if you're a large enough environment, might be an option to look at.
Yep, definitely. And you mentioned live migration a couple of times. For the VMware folks, just in case you're not aware, live migration equals vMotion, just so you're aware.
Same thing, that's right. I should mention as well, it's in preview at the moment, Azure Migrate, that we talked about earlier, migrating to Azure, also works for migrating to Azure Stack HCI. So if you have a bunch of VMware stuff on-prem, and you're going, hey, we're going to go to Azure Stack HCI, you actually have the whole migration journey is now built in. And this is obviously Microsoft's response to the Broadcom dumpster fire, as you called it. If you need to do that, look at Azure Stack HCI and go that way.
Right. Now, I did say at the beginning of this episode that there's a security angle here, and there is, and we're getting to that. So I think it's that part of the show. And so there's 2 big security things that I want to bring up as part of this discussion. The first one is, I have seen throughout my 22, 23-ish years in the industry now, this happened a couple of times where there's some big thing that happens in the industry, this time the Broadcom fiasco, right? Where people start making ill-advised and maybe too fast of migrations to something else, right? They say, oh crap, our renewal is up in 3 months or 6 months or whatever. We have to move now. Do it now. Quick, jump. And they move haphazardly. And what happens when we tend to rush things from a security perspective? We tend to make mistakes. leave the front door open, do silly things, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's amplified by the fact that, okay, I am now migrating from a platform that I know very well. I'm putting myself in the shoes of the sysadmin who's migrating. You probably know VMware very well if you've been using it for years. Now you're being forced to move to a new platform that you maybe don't know very well. And so in terms of security, you may not know what you don't know with that new platform.
Yeah.
So my point in bringing this back to a security angle is when you're starting to plan that migration and starting to do those risk assessments, you really have to understand the new platform, understand what the risk profile is for that new platform, what the common security pitfalls are, go look at hardening guides for that new platform. Don't make the transition take longer than you have to, but don't rush it either,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because that creates all kinds of security issues. I don't know if there's anything you would add to that, Paul.
There's two things I want to add. The first one is if you're looking to move to public cloud and it maybe isn't something that you've used a lot of, and if you're a big VMware customer today in 2024, you're probably not maybe using public cloud as much. So remember, you're not just shifting platforms. I mean, I suppose if you move to AVS, you're still on VMware, but you're in the cloud. So remember that the whole networking infrastructure is now very different. And this is something worth considering. So a classic example that I heard from a colleague of mine he's a security expert. They were brought in to do a verification of a migration in progress. Again, was happening quite quickly, but at least this company went, hey, we probably need some security experts to come in and have a look at this. So they looked at, they had done a literally lift and shift, picked up, I can't remember how many it was, but dozens or maybe even hundreds of virtual machines. One of them was a very important business machine that had been running on premises, being accessible from the internal network directly, via direct interfaces. And they just moved it to the cloud, but to keep it working, they had literally opened it to the internet so that people could get into that machine and do what they needed to do, right? And they just hadn't thought about it. They just didn't think about the concept of, hey, our LAN is not the same thing as the internet, you know what I mean? So the security risks were gigantic, but in this case, they caught it before it happened. So you do need to think about that, right? And there are many security services that you can use in Azure, such as Bastion hosts. So you've got to get into the Bastion host before you can get to SSH or RDP into your machines, your Linux or Windows servers. And you can, of course, have MFA, right? So you can't even get to the portal to go and manage your machines in the cloud without MFA, because we've heard scenarios over the last few years where people have had their ESXi hosts encrypted with ransomware because they were open to the internet. So don't do that in Azure.
Very much so. Exactly. The one final thing I want to bring up from a security perspective is a lot of people focus so much on the act of the migration that they don't stop to properly plan, okay, we've migrated, now what, right? And the one thing that I've seen missed multiple times in these situations is like, oh, what about backup?
Mm-hmm.
We have to back up our stuff again, right? And so, whether you're in the cloud or on premises, that changes that discussion. If you're, using VMware on premises, you probably have a backup solution already, but now you need something that supports Hyper-V or supports Azure Stack HCI. Shameless plug. Hornet Security VM Backup supports Azure Stack HCI. Just FYI, in case anybody needs a solution there. But I digress. But that's one thing that I see people miss all the time is, they finish the migration, away they go, and hopefully they've remembered to, start doing backups of their new environment, right?
Good, important thing. So what can help here is the cloud adoption framework. It is linked in the article. So once you get the link to the article, you can read about that. So the cloud adoption framework has been around for years. It's a fantastic free resource from Microsoft that talks about how you should plan your migration to the cloud. And even if you're in a rush, it's a really good idea to have a look at that, look at some of the planning documents and checklists they've got in there to make sure that you don't forget to do your backup. And I suppose the one thing I would finish off with here is IT and human beings in general, really, but us in IT, we tend to have ideological battles, Mac versus PC, or I don't know, Linux versus Windows, or Google Workspace versus Microsoft 365, or, of course, VMware versus Hyper-V. And that's been going for, decades at this point. But I think in the end, as an IT professional, right, the bottom line is you buy products and services from companies to help you more efficiently run your business. And VMware is an infrastructure play at this point for your data center infrastructure. And if you have an ideological attachment to it, I think that the finance people in your organization are going to blow some big holes in your ideological attachment at this point. Because if you're getting like a 5x increase like the guy we mentioned here, that's just not sustainable. Like you just, like, nobody else does that. You don't get a 5x electricity bill just because the electricity company wanted to get some extra money, right? You can't run your business on that. And in those scenarios, really, Hyper-V is battle tested. It's been around for a really long time, whether it shows up in Azure or in Azure Stack HCI or in Windows Server itself. I think, maybe dropping the religious battles and just looking at what's reality here and what's the fact and what's going to help us the most to run our business more efficiently.
Yep. Amen. I couldn't say it any better than that. I'm not a religious person, but that felt like it was necessary there. So, anyway, well, Paul, I think that about wraps it up for today. As always, appreciate you being here, sharing your insights, and I'm sure I will have you. Well, I know that you're going to be back on the show soon. We're going to talk about confidential computing here not too long from now. So, looking forward to that.
Yeah, this was a great conversation. Thanks.
For sure, definitely. And all of you watching, hope you enjoyed your time with us today. If you are interested in finding us out on the interwebs, we're available on all the major podcasting platforms. We're also available on YouTube. So if you're watching on YouTube right now, be sure to smash that like and subscribe button, as they say. With that, we'll let you get back to your day. Thanks for watching. We'll see you again next week for another episode of the Security Swarm podcast. Catch you later.